Russian economy is definitely been very hard hit by the global crisis. It, however, is not been hit the worst. It has not showed the worst performance of any economy in the world, nor the best. So in many measures, it's about in the middle. Now, there's one indicator that Russia does seem to be always occupying last place, and that's the performance of its stock market. Russian stock market in 2008 declined by almost 80%. Many of its other peer nations, say the other BRIC nations, China or India or Brazil, are more like between 60 and 70, 65%. However, I would explain that by pointing out that the Russian stock market in the preceding period, in 2007, soared to bigger heights. It was a bigger bubble. And so with a bigger bubble to start off with, it's only natural in a sense that your deflation is going to be bigger. But when it comes to measures like the loss of foreign exchange reserves, or the decline in GDP growth rates, or the currency exchange rate, yes, Russia has suffered, but countries like Great Britain, Australia, Sweden, on some of these measures, they've been worse off than Russia.
The Russian economy right now is in a state of shock, partly as a response to the global economic crisis. The situation in Russia is very much the outcome of Russia's participation in the world economy, first as a big oil exporter, and secondly as a holder of international reserves and a borrower of capital from the rest of the world. So when the international financial crisis took place, worldwide deleveraging took place, and Russia, which had been a big borrower of foreign capital to support its banking system, saw a big outflow of capital, a big threat to its banking system. That caused collapse of its stock markets. Secondly, the international financial system collapsing has led to a big fall in world oil prices. And since Russia is the second largest exporter of oil and the largest exporter of gas, it's taken a big hit on the vital sector of its economy. And that filters through the rest of the economy. So the Russian economy has been hit, secondly, by that. So these are two twin effects from this world economic crisis.
So what should Russia do about this? I mean, what are the correct policy choices? Well, the answer to that is, tell me, what is the consensus about what to do to get ourselves out of this crisis? And I say ourselves because we're all facing more or less the same, a whole set of the same types of problems. Is there a consensus in the United States what to do? Hardly. We may have a general sense that we need a big stimulus package, we need to save jobs, we need to keep people in their homes, and so forth and so on. But how much should we spend on that? Should we do it through tax cuts, or should we do it through budgetary spending? Should we do it quickly? Should we do it, more long term? These are exact same questions that Russia faces. Every other country does as well. And here too, by the way, I would describe the magnitude of the measures that Russia has committed itself to, the Russian government has committed itself to, that we describe as stimulus and bailouts. They're roughly the same as many of the other countries in the developed world, the United States or the Western European countries. They're very large. Russia actually accumulated very large reserves. And in that sense, Russia came into this crisis better prepared. It had built up large reserves. It had the third largest foreign exchange reserves in the world. And that gives it more flexibility than a country like Ukraine or some of the other countries that have suffered tremendously. But that doesn't mean that they won't face big problems if the crisis continues, and especially if it deepens. And nobody knows. The Russians don't know. We don't know. And so they're going to have to, in a sense, just ride this whole thing out the same way that everybody is doing. And it will largely not be what they do. It will be what happens to the global economy. Many people look at at Russia's current crisis and ask, could they have done something differently to avoid this? And a common answer that I hear is, well, if they had diversified away from their oil economy, if they weren't so totally dependent on oil and oil revenues, they would not have suffered as deeply. Well, first of all, that may well be true if Russia didn't have as much oil, but I think a lot else is involved. Ukraine doesn't have oil. Ukraine is a basket case right now. I mean, there are many counterexamples to that. But more fundamentally is that, like it or not, I don't think a big diversification effort, diversifying your economy into non-oil producing sectors, would have been helpful to Russia in this crisis. It might be a wise thing to do in the long term, but precisely because of this crisis, Russia is fortunate that it had large oil revenues for several years prior to the crisis, and this is important, that it took a large part of those revenues and put them away in reserves. It didn't spend them immediately, didn't consume them immediately. It put them in its foreign exchange reserves in a so-called special oil stabilization fund that was set up specifically for the, quote, rainy day, the day in which the oil revenues would not be flowing in at the same way. So, frankly, there's room for praise for Russia, and especially Russia's macroeconomic and fiscal policies. There's certainly ways you can criticize them. But again, I'll go back and make my point about international comparison. This, what I say, is true of every country in the world. Nobody prepared adequately for this. Nobody expected it. And compared with many other countries, Russia did more.
The future of the Russian economy will depend to a large extent on what happens with oil prices. It's very hard right now for policymakers to make a program for the near future without coming to some forecast for what happens to oil prices. You really have to think about what to do if oil prices stay where they are and the international financial system stays where it is, or if oil prices recover somewhat, because so much of the budget, so much of the economy is dependent on that. But what is critical that I would emphasize is that Russia has to make sure it keeps producing oil. What matters now is how to ensure that Russian oil production can recover. And that's a very difficult problem to deal with, because most of Russia's untapped reserves are in eastern Siberia, and that's not the easiest place to tap oil. It's going to require very large infrastructure projects, large investments in capital, large amounts of risk sharing. It's not clear how that will be done, but that's an important issue that Russia will have to deal with.
A lot of people are maybe hoping, but at least they're stating that owing to its current economic downturn and a weakening of the Russian economy, perhaps Russia will have to pull back somewhat from its aggressiveness in its foreign policy, because the argument goes that it was thanks to Russia's economic boom through the high oil prices that Russia changed its attitude. It was no longer just sitting quietly. It started to become more active and even aggressive in its foreign policy. I think we need to be aware of the fact that Russia's foreign policy is indeed connected to its economy and its economic performance, but not in the sense that Russia today is an economically healthy country, and before was unhealthy, and now is heading back maybe towards unhealth. The key is simply to understand one simple fact about Russia's economy, and that is the relationship between its foreign debt, how much it owed to the outside world, and the reserves of foreign currency that it had built up to protect itself, to be able to pay off both its foreign debt and its imports. When Putin came in 1999, and right after that 1998 economic crisis, Russia had just a tiny foreign exchange reserve fund. It was $6-7 billion. It built up to $600 billion by the middle of 2008. That was the third largest in the world. At the same time, he paid off the government's foreign debt from well over $100 billion down to a very modest amount, and by the way, fully paid off the debt to the IMF and other international creditors. It was when he achieved what you might describe as real financial sovereignty. So Russia was no longer beholden to the foreign lenders, that he could act independently. And as soon as he could act independently, he did. The tone changed immediately. Russia still has, it has spent a good bit of its foreign exchange reserves to defend the exchange rate of the ruble. It still has the third largest reserves in the world. These are far beyond adequate to maintain this financial independence. And I believe Putin will keep that. He will make sure that these reserves are large enough. He will fiercely defend this financial sovereignty precisely so that Russia can pursue the foreign political, geopolitical policies that he deems necessary. Short answer then is no. I don't think this is, at least as it's expired so far, this crisis is not going to make Russia more docile, more benign, less active, or even aggressive. It's not going to change that.
Russia is, in the last years, has taken a more independent stance. You know, from our perspective, it seems sometimes like Russia is acting more as a belligerent, and Russia, they would be saying, we're defending our own interests, acting in our own interests. To some extent, the way Russia behaves is a reaction to the way we behave. But I think that as Russia was successful in paying off its foreign debts and accumulating large reserves, Russia once again wanted to act as an important player, as a country that demands respect. I don't think that's going to change in the near future. Russia still is has the third largest foreign reserves in the world. Russia is still the second largest oil producer in the world, and I don't think Russia is going to change its behavior in the sense of wanting to defend its own national interests, especially in what it calls its near abroad.